Right, can everybody hear me? Right, let's start the lecture if we can. Okay, it's entitled Meet the Denisovans, the True Founders of a Lost Civilization. I changed the title at the last minute because that's essentially what we're talking about here. And this is the thing that's going to change everything, and it's the reason why Graham Hancock was in Siberia about a month ago, going to the Denisovan cave and looking at all the sites. And it's something myself and my colleagues, including Debbie Cartwright and Richard Wald, have been working on for the last 5 years. And the fruits of it will be coming out in a book entitled The Cygnus Key, the Denisovan Legacy, Gobekli Tepe and the Birth of Egypt. The publisher likes long titles. And it's all because of this. Now, this is part of what you call a bangle or a wrist bracelet, which was found in a place called the Denisovan Cave, which we'll come on to shortly, in 2008, and it came from layer 11. Now, layer 11 dates to approximately between 40 and about 70,000 years ago. And recently, it's actually officially come out that this is 60 to 70,000 years old. That's what they now believe. And the importance about this is that, firstly, there's evidence of high-speed drilling actually within the width of it. It's immensely sophisticated, the style of finish. It's a high-status item. You know, it's not obviously for the riffraff or anything. And it was probably worn by an elite woman. And the most important thing is that we weren't around in Siberia at this time. So it has to have been made by one of our predecessors. And since all the evidence of the so-called Denisovans has come out from the same layer, the archaeologists are accepting that this was made by Denisovans, and that changes everything. Now, and the reason why it changes everything is because the next time that this type of technology comes out again is at the beginning of the Neolithic period, around 8000 BC. This bangle was found at a place called Gobekli Tepe, which I've visited in southern central Turkey, and there was an obsidian wrist bracelet found there, which you can see here, that dates to that time. And this was seen as incredibly sophisticated in its own right when it was found, you know, that we had this technology as far back as then. Well, now we know that that technology goes back at least to 60, 70,000 years and doesn't even belong to us as Homo sapiens. It comes from the Denisovans. So, where was it found? This place called the Denisovan Cave. It's in Siberia. I'll show you a map in a second. In southern Siberia. It has 22 levels of occupation, dating obviously from recent to around 300,000 years ago. By the way, the 22 levels are not on top of each other. They relate to two different areas that have been divided up into 22 levels. Layer 11 is the Denisovan layer. That's where most of the funky stuff has been found. The location of it is essentially on the border, the Russian border, it's actually in Russia, between Russia, Kazakhstan, China and Mongolia. It's almost on the point of coming together of those four different countries. And it's a very interesting area, but we'll come on to that. Now, a number of other things have been found in the layer 11 that are all now attributed to the Denisovans, including this beautiful needle that is at least 40,000 years old, arguably the oldest needle in the world. And what this tells us, almost certainly, is that the Denisovans wore tailored clothing. In other words, they were making their own clothes. So they not only had sophisticated jewellery, but they had tailored clothing as well. DNA evidence has been discovered in the cave, plus actual remains now, of a type of horse that existed 50,000 years ago, and this was found again in layer 11. And this particular story makes it clear. It says, an early attempt of equine domestication cannot be ruled out. The Denisovans rode horses. And if you consider that it isn't accepted that people rode horses until the Bronze Age, this is really, really important. The type of horse is a now extinct form called the ovudov, however that's pronounced, which was more closely related to the zebra than it was to modern horses. So, you know, that hung around in that area and at least until 24 to 26,000 years ago. They found evidence of it in another cave in the Sayan Mountains to the north of the area of the Denisova Cave, which, by the way, is the Altai Mountains, okay, the Altai. Now, a lot has been written and a lot has been broadcast already on the Denisovans. The Nat Geo did a whole documentary about it and also a feature in their magazine on it. And they created this picture which showed modern humans coming into contact with Denisovans for the first time. So we're at the back, you know, just arriving there, and the guys in the front are the Denisovans. Now, they don't know what the Denisovans look like, or certainly the artists for Nat Geo didn't anyway, so that's why they've got our back to us, and I'll show you the reason why in a minute. But obviously we look much more familiar, turning up, and it's this curious meeting between the two, and how did they get on? Did one stab the other or whatever? You know, did they shake hands? We don't know. Although I don't think that's quite necessarily the way it went down. But, you know, the fact of the matter is we arrived in this area around 40 to 45,000 years ago. Although there were earlier humans that had reached Australia by around 60 to 65,000, they are not thought to have taken this route through southern Siberia, because the earliest evidence that we've got of anatomical remains of humans, you know, as in humankind, is from about 45,000 years ago. And it's just on the north side of the Altai, so in this same proximity. The Denisovans were around from about 800 to 40,000 years ago. There doesn't seem to be any real evidence yet, although some people have predicted we will find it, that they lasted beyond around 40,000 years ago, and that their last stronghold was the area of the Denisova Cave, the Altai Mountains, and southern Siberia, let's assume, in general. But as we'll see from the DNA evidence that has come out, they were clearly all over the place, certainly as far as East Asia is concerned and in the American continent. So what do we know about the Denisovans themselves? What's actually been found? Well, to date, I know it sounds meagre, but we can make an awful lot from it, is that there's only been 4 pieces of fossil remains of the Denisovans found and confirmed. And most of the work that's been done on this is the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig in Germany. Dr. Svante Pääbo being the main guy involved with all the DNA work on the actual human remains. So we've actually got 3 different teeth, 2 seemingly from adults, 1 from a child, you know, a teenager, and a piece of a little finger, a pinky as they call it. That's it. That's all we've got. But the most important thing, and by the way, they've all been found in the Denisova Cave, because that's where they've been looking for it. That's not the fact that they haven't found it elsewhere, it's just that tests have not been done yet. And the important thing about the Denisova Cave is because it's cold there and because of the type of soil, that human remains have been preserved, fossilised in a manner which allows the DNA extraction. That's both nuclear DNA and obviously mitochondrial DNA, which is basically the bacteria, the DNA of our bacteria that's within the body, that's passed on from mother to child. We have not got anything else. We have not got a skull. We have not got any other bones. Again, that's not to say that they have not been found, but that we've got to work with what we have so far. Now, the important thing about all 4 of the pieces of anatomical evidence that we have so far is that every single one of them show that the Denisovans were of large size. And this is brought out, for instance, in one of the tooth here, which is actually referred to in the Nat Geo TV documentary as a giant tooth. Bence Viola, one of the paleoanthropologists working on this, basically has said that when they first discovered one of these molars, that it was so large that they thought that it belonged to a cave bear. And all of this is so significant because all of this tells us that the Denisovans were incredibly large in size, both in girth and also probably in height as well. So who exactly were the Denisovans? How do they fit into this? Because they're not Homo sapiens, they're not Neanderthals, the DNA tells us this. What we know is that they're completely unique, and that until something like 2008, we had no idea that they even existed. Well, the evidence comes from the family tree of the hominin species that obviously includes ourselves, and you've got it here. But I'll break this down as easily as I possibly can. The Denisovans here on the right-hand side, Homo Denisova, or various other names which have been suggested. They haven't actually come up with a proper name that's going to be absolutely fixed in the history books yet. And the common ancestor behind all of us seems to be a type of human called Homo Heidelbergensis, who Hugh mentioned earlier on. Now, they existed at least from around 1 million years ago to around 800,000 years ago, and arguably they remained and existed a long time after that, maybe even to 400 to 300,000 years ago. But what it's believed, and this is what the paleoanthropologists now put out, is that it's that the Denisovans branched off from Homo Heidelbergensis probably around 800,000 years ago. And then another branch of Homo Heidelbergensis continued on, and from those came both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens that split off probably around 200, 250,000 years ago. So in other words, what all this suggests is that the common ancestor is Homo Heidelbergensis. Others dispute this and say, well, what about Homo erectus? How does that fit into the picture? But I don't want to go into that today. But I think that they are right with the Homo Heidelbergensis for the reasons which I will show you in a second. And that's the fact that the discovery of the very first evidence for the existence of Homo Heidelbergensis came from a place called Mauer, just outside of Heidelberg in 1907. And it was the discovery inside this quarry pit of a jaw, which you can see here up on the screen. This is actually a model of it, which dates to around 600,000 years ago and is massive. I mean, it is arguably one of the largest skulls of a hominin that's actually ever been discovered, and that it was realised that it was unique. It was seen to be linked obviously with Neanderthals. It was felt that the Neanderthals were like a later version of the Homo Heidelbergensis, and that they were more archaic even than the Neanderthals. But the thing is that the Neanderthals really are something completely separate to the Denisovans or the Homo Heidelbergensis, in the sense that they look completely different. I mean, the Neanderthals were very robust, but they were very tiny. They were probably only about 5 feet in height. They had hunched, as far as we know, shoulders. Their bones were extremely thick, and they were well adapted for extremely cold weather, which obviously there would have been a lot of in the time of the different ice ages. Whereas the Denisovans seem to be completely different in the physiological makeup, as we'll see. But what's so important about Homo Heidelbergensis is that when their bones have been found in South Africa, they are regularly, or routinely, as it says here, over 7 feet tall. And this comes from one of the paleoanthropologists who's been doing the work on it, Professor Lee Berger, statement that was made in 2007. So in other words, if the Denisovans are descended of the Heides, as we call them, I won't keep using their full term, from the Heides, then you know, they also may well have got their height and their girth from the Heides, basically. And the reason why we know that they're connected with the Heides is because of the discovery in a cave in Spain, which is called the Cima de los Huesos, and please excuse my Spanish pronunciation there, because archaeologists have been for many years, and you can see them at work here, investigating a rock shelter and cave site that was used essentially to dump human remains. And they looked at fossil remains of a human that dated to 430,000 years ago that they assumed was Neanderthal. Sorry, that they assumed was Heidelbergensis. But when they actually did the test, it came out that the mitochondrial DNA, which remember is the bacterial DNA inside our bodies, was closer to the Denisovans than it was to the Neanderthals. And the importance about this is that the Neanderthals occupied the Eurasian continent from essentially the middle of it to the west, although they were also here and there in East Asia. Whereas the Denisovans, so far, the only DNA evidence we have of them is east of that, what I call the Denisovan Line, which we'll talk about as we go along. And that's from basically Siberia right the way through to Ireland, Southeast Asia and Indonesia, and beyond even into the Australia and Micronesia, Melanesia. So to find that these people who were considered to be the forerunners of the Neanderthals at this cave in Spain was a total spanner in the works, because it suggested that they were closer, the Heides there were closer to the Denisovans than they were to the Neanderthals. Now this has caused a lot of people like Chris Stringer of Cambridge University to quickly try and change the goalposts on this, but the facts of the matter are that the Heides are linked with the Denisovans, basically. So what did the Denisovans look like? Well, again, because we know that the Heides were possibly as much as 7 feet tall, possibly even taller than that, and all of the anatomical remains found so far in the Denisova cave were of extreme large size, including giant teeth. We think that we know what they look like, and this is going to be the big reveal here, because we think that this person who I'm going to show you now is the closest that you're going to get to the physique and the height of a Denisovan who's living today. And this is, I'm not just saying he's the only one, but this is about the best that we found. And it's the great Khalil Dalip Singh Rani, again, excuse my pronunciation, who is I believe he's an Indian-born wrestler who lives in America, has actually, fought in the WWE. And you can just see how high this guy is, next to this lady here. That is what a Denisovan looked like. The chin is probably too pointed. We don't think that their chins were as pointed as that. That's a human trait. We also think that the eyes, there's good reason to suggest that their eyes were extremely white with black eyeballs, but that comes from legends and certain traditions and certain associations that we feel are linked with albinos, but that's something that I'm going to leave for the day. Now, in the area where the Denisova cave is located in the Altai Mountains, there are lots of legends about giants. Now, we know that there are giant legends all over the world. Obviously, Jim and Hugh both talked about giant legends in different parts of the world today. And true to form, obviously, they are in the area of the Altai Mountains. And I've looked into these in incredible detail, and all of this is brought out in the Cygnus Key, which is out next April, May. And some of the things that are said about these giants. And bearing in mind, this image here is actually is a reconstruction of Altaic giants, and look how close it is to this guy. I mean, and this was done quite separately to anything to do with an understanding of the Denisovans. So I am pretty certain that some of the legends to do with the giants of the Altai region relate to the Denisovans and go back to a time of them which is up to around 40,000 years ago, or relates to their hybrid descendants who will also have been of a similar size, certainly for countless generations and certainly for probably maybe up to 10,000 years at least. So I'm going to talk now about the fact that one of the legends is connected with the Altaic giants, again very similar to Britain and other parts of the world, is that they were responsible for the first monuments, the first monumental architecture that existed in this area. Now, although that means some of it goes back 40,000 years, I think we need to start considering the possibility that megalithic architecture began with the Denisovans. Now, this is scant evidence, and what I'm going to show you now is not necessarily the best evidence. I go into the best evidence in the book, but and this is the so-called not super giants, should be super megaliths actually, of Gornaya Shoria, the Shoria Mountains, and these are actually here at this location here. You can see this red circle and an arrow pointing there, just to the north really of the Denisovan Cave, and this is what we see. Now, I've not been there. We are, and I'll tell you about this at the end, trying to get a Siberian tour up there for 2019 to investigate some of this stuff. Unfortunately, it probably won't at this time include seeing the super megaliths because they are so remote. It would take a specialist tour just on its own to actually reach them. But we will be going to various other sites that I've identified as associated with the Denisovans. And there are huge, great blocks that some now believe are artificial in nature. You can see some here, and obviously a doorway cut at some point within them. Here's the edges of others, and here's another one here. Now, I dismissed all of this as natural up to a certain point. And when I say a certain point, a certain time, when I began to start realising that there may be something in this. The picture which intrigued me from the set that was released, you can see them all online, is this picture, because this doesn't look natural to me. These are two huge blocks that are on firm ground, and this looks like it's been placed there. So that is one of the small pieces of evidence that suggests to me, there is others, that this could actually be artificial in nature. And if it is, I do not believe that it was done recently. I believe that it was done a long time ago, and there is a slim possibility that it may relate to Denisovan activity in this region. And that's exactly what the stories tell us about what the Denisovans were up, the giants of Altai were up to. Now, there are more connections between giants in this region outside of the legends of the local people. For instance, in Greek myth, there's the story of the lost kingdom of Hyperborea. Now, the Hyperborea over the ages has been placed all over the place, everywhere from Bulgaria to the North Pole, Greenland, to Britain. And in fact, some people associate one story of some kind of circular precinct to actually Stonehenge. I may have even mentioned it in one of my books. But research that I've done, and also by a guy called Geoffrey Ashe, in a book called Dawn Before the Dawn, which is really, really important as a forerunner of all of this work, basically shows that the earliest accounts of Hyperborea place it in the area of the Altai Mountains. Now, this was Geoffrey Ashe wrote this before anything to do with the Denisovans. In fact, I introduced him in January this year to the whole of the Denisovans and said, look, a lot of what you said is now coming to pass about some kind of lost civilization having its roots in the Altai Mountains. You're right, and we now have the evidence. And the story really that I want to concentrate on relates to something that was told by a people to a traveller and these people were known as the Isidines, and they were probably connected with the Scythians, the Scythian race, the Scythian people that existed on the Russian steppe, right from the area to the north of the Black Sea, all the way across to the very foothills of the Altai Mountains, which are just beyond the Ural Mountains, and obviously in Siberia or Asia proper. And the Isidines talked about these people that existed that were basically related to the north wind, Boreas. And one of the stories that's told by a Greek writer called Hecatius of Abdera, probably written down about 350 BC, but probably from a much earlier age, talks about the three sons of Boreas, basically the king of Hyperborea, which I am certain relates to the area of the Altai Mountains. And it said that these three sons of Boreas were in height. I can't remember exactly now, but in height, it was something about 2.5 meters in height, and there were three of them, and that they were priests of the god Apollo, whose main primary animistic form is the swan, and that they did this incredible ritual in this precinct, which is the same one that also gets linked with Stonehenge, where they called down the swans, and all these swans appeared out of nowhere and circled round and land and enter into the chant and chorus that they're creating and remain for the entire day until the ritual, and that's quite clearly what it was, ended, and then all the swans lift up and take off again. Now, it's an incredible story, but as I said, the three sons of Boreas are said to have been about 2.5 meters in height, right? So we're talking, 9 to 10 foot or even more. And I became intrigued, and I started to think, I wonder if this is something to do with the Denisovans. And what's so interesting about the area concerned of the Altai regions is that some of the earliest evidence of bone whistles and flutes in the world have been uncovered there. And in fact, the evidence that I found, I can link them directly with the Denisovans. And it's my opinion that they invented music and invented the earliest bone whistles and flutes. But the most important thing is that they were made of swan bone, or if they couldn't use that, geese bone. Now, these are later found in places like Germany, but the earliest forms of them seem to have come out of southern Siberia and were also continued on by the earliest human communities in this area who, as I said, reached there about 40 to 45,000 years ago. Again, this is something I'm going to be bringing out in the Cygnus Key book. But there are lots of traditions to do with swans in southern Siberia. And directly linked with giants. I mean, for instance, there is a giant who is a culture hero of the Altai and some of the surrounding areas called Alp Manas, or Manas. And there's lots of deeds relating to him. He's said to be accompanied by this eagle, which is obviously some sort of shamanic totem thing that follows him around, just like that earlier image I showed of the other Altaic giant. But what's so interesting is that here he's directly linked with the swan. His daughter is said to be a swan maiden who can transform into a bird and fly over the kingdom and do stuff and then transform herself back into human form. And swans are this big symbol, other than the eagle, in the whole area of southern Siberia. This is Swan City, basically. Everything relates to swans in this area. And you've even got the swan people of the Altai, this whole sort of tribe that claim that they're of descent of a swan, but they're not the only ones. There are a large number of tribes and clans in southern Siberia that claim that their ancestress was a swan who took human form and married a mortal man, and she was around, and they gave birth to one or more children, and then she goes back to what's known as birdland, some bird heaven, which can be directly linked with the constellation of Cygnus, but that's something that we'll talk about a little later on. And I am certain all these stories go back at least to 40 to 45,000 years ago and relate to the early contact between humankind, ourselves, and the Denisovans, because one of their primary symbols, I'm certain, was the swan, but also the eagle. Okay. Now, moving on, is that we know that the DNA of the Denisovans has been found in a large number of human populations around the world. Interestingly enough, so far nothing basically to the west of Siberia. So from that point to the edge of the European continent, Britain, Spain, France, etc., nothing. Not that it's there, but they just haven't found it in any modern population. However, they found it in Central Asian populations, they found it in various Siberian populations, and as we'll come on to next, in North American populations. But the reason why I've rung this is that one of the highest amounts of Denisovan DNA that's been found in modern populations in Central Asia is the Turkmen, basically the forerunners of the Turks, the Turkish people, who come from this area. They come from the Altai region. And also the Selkups, which is another tribe that have their origins in southern Siberia. They're now mostly in north and in northeast Siberia, but they have links into southern Siberia, the area of the Altai and the Sayan Mountains, which are immediately to the north of there. So, in other words, the link with the Denisovans of the past remains with some of these populations in Siberia today. However, what's most interesting about this chart that you can see here is that there is a large number of Native American modern populations that have Denisovan DNA, with the top amount coming from the Ojibwa, again, excuse pronunciations here, who are linked with the Algonquins and essentially in north to northeast North America. So we're talking about Canada and the area around the Great Lakes area specifically, which is interesting that it's not further to the west where you would find obvious links if people had come over directly from Siberia. Now, obviously, Hugh and Jim have talked to you all about the giants, particularly those obviously in America. And of course there are thousands of accounts of giant skeletons being found there. So are they linked in some way with the Denisovans? Well, in a book which I contributed to, written by my colleague Greg Little, I probably was the first person in the world to write, in a scholarly manner, that the giant skeletons of America are almost certainly hybrids of Denisovans and possibly Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and that eventually we will find that this is correct. I mean, since that time, it's all over the place. You can find it, but I don't think there was any references prior to that time. And that is my belief, and I still hold to this, that we will find that the 7-8 footers that have been found in mound complexes, burial places all over the United States and obviously in Canada and obviously elsewhere, particularly in the American continent, will have Denisovan DNA in them. I'm fairly confident about that. The problem is, as Jim and Hugh will tell you, all of the giant bones now no longer exist. It's not really a conspiracy. It's just the fact that the American law told the Smithsonian and all of the other state-run museums in the NAPRA law they had to repatriate all of the millions of Native American bones, whether they were recently, from time of Columbus, etc., 10,000, 30,000 years, or whatever it was, and obviously not that age, but certainly 10, 11,000 had to be repatriated. And that's why all of these storerooms that used to have all these bones are now empty, because they were repatriated. But the fact of the matter is, the bones were found. Skeletons, huge skulls, some of them with 6 fingers and 6 toes, as Jim was saying, they existed. So, and many of these are from scholarly reports. They're not just from newspaper accounts. And a pattern emerges, one that my colleague Greg Little is writing about in a new book that I'm doing, not the Cygnus Key, a one we're working on together. And that's the fact that the elite of these Native American groups would appear to have been always of huge stature, basically of tall stature, 7-footers, 8-footers. And when found, mixed with normal-sized people, they would always be in the middle, and that they were very often, obviously, either an elite or shamans. These were the ones that had the knowledge, the wisdom. They were in control of the Native American tribes. And this has now become known as the Adena elite hypothesis, based on the work that Greg and I have done relating to this in the book Path of Souls. And there is an actual critique, a skeptic by the name of Andy White, who's Jim and Hugh will shudder by the name, but he's one of the only skeptics that's actually now come out and said, okay, I think there is something in the discovery of these giant skeletons, and he called it the Adena elite hypothesis. And basically what he's saying is that the guys in charge of the Adena, who basically were around from about 500 BC to about 200 AD, were almost, were very much these giants, and that they somehow were part of a lineage, a tradition, and that they existed. So that's pretty cool. This is probably what these hybrids look like. Thanks to Russell Hussein put this together, reconstructed it, basically on suggestions of myself and Debbie Cartwright, who I must big up here, that if it hadn't have been for her, I would not have got onto the Denisovans so quickly. 5 years we've been working on this. Graham Hancock is now onto it, as you know, and he's shot out to the Denisovan cave within the last month or so, and clearly his next book is all going to be about it as well. That's a book that's going to be published in 2019. But my book, the Cygnus Key, will be out next year, so you'll be able to have a look at that. But anyway, this is, what we wanted to try and put together what we felt these hybrids looked like, and this was what one of the American giants we think looked like. So, not the most beautiful of guys, obviously, but hey, each to their own. So, now, moving away from the American continent for a second, this is the sort of heat map, if you like, of Denisovan DNA. And you can see that the red ringed area is where up to 5% of Denisovan DNA has been found, with the largest concentrations in the area of Indonesia, northern Australia, Southeast Asia, obviously amongst certain Chinese populations, including the Han and the Yi people. Obviously in North America, some, although it's not really made aware there, a lot in South America. South America is where it all really began, and a lot of stuff moved from South America to North America. That's something we'll be writing about. But look at the blue area. That's to the west of what I call the Denisovan Line. And that Denisovan Line, by the way, goes from the area of the Sayan Mountains, the Altai Mountains, down to the Bay of Bengal, that basically divides India and Myanmar, which is obviously the old Burma. So west of the line, no Denisovan, only Neanderthal DNA found within modern populations. There's a lot of stories recently about, did the Denisovans discover Australia? Did they get there 60, 65,000 years ago? Very likely. I think they probably did have some kind of boats, sea vessels or whatever. And how do we fit into the picture? Well, as I've said, we arrived in the area of southern Siberia around 45,000 years ago. Here's the route that we probably took to get there. We would have encountered the Denisovans at this time, and I think that the Denisovans knew they were on the way out, because there doesn't appear to have been a lot of them. And I think that they somehow integrated with the modern humans, ourselves, the anatomical modern humans, and hybrids came from it, and these hybrids became elites. Who were elite groups that did things. Obviously the DNA started to water down, and although it was obviously moving a lot towards the east, towards Southeast Asia, towards the Americas, etc., it didn't go to the west. So how do we fit into the picture? What happened to the wisdom and knowledge of the Denisovans, which they clearly had? Well, that's something that I'll try and bring out if we've got the time here. But one of the important things, and I don't want to bore you with a whole load of stuff to do with stone tools, which is one of my pet areas of interest, is that something starts in the area of the Denisovans, which essentially we'd not seen before, other than a very brief sporadic appearance about 60 to 70,000 years ago in South Africa. Something appears in this very area that becomes very important to tool making at a later point, and that's known as pressure flaking. Pressure flaking is a highly sophisticated technique of creating stone tools that moves from the area of the Altai and what's called the Trans-Baikal region, which is just to the south of there in what's today Mongolia, westwards through the Ural Mountains very slowly until eventually it enters Europe and is picked up by a people known as the Solutreans. Now, the Solutreans are very, very sophisticated, important people that existed mostly in Western Europe, but almost certainly began their migrations from the areas of Eastern Europe. This is denied now by paleoanthropologists, but I firmly believe that this is the case, and that they created the most sophisticated technology. Now, I think they were probably related to the Neanderthals as well, but they have a number of firsts and a number of interesting things. They were the first people that created rock art, basically, and what I mean by that is chiselled, sculpted art in stone friezes, set them up inside caves and rock shelters, like you can see here. This is from, Roc des Seurs, a site in France, preempting what later will be the mainstream of the creation of the stone carved pillars at Gobekli Tepe, and I will hopefully get onto that. And this is found at a number of locations, so I think that there's a link here between the Solutreans and what eventually ends up in Gobekli Tepe. The Solutreans would also seem to have had a fixed cosmological geography revolving around the constellation of Cygnus and the area of the Summer Triangle, the turning points of the heavens when they were around from about 20 to about 15,000 BC. And this is brought out in a scene in the Lascaux cave in southern France that shows a birdman, a bird on the pole and a bison, which was interpreted in 1999 by a guy called Michael Rappengluck of Munich University. And this is shown inside a circular pit, and it's on the north wall, exactly in the position, if you were to be able to see through the rock, to where the stars of Cygnus would have been at that time. But I'll come back to the Cygnus connection. Now, the other important thing that some of you will know about the Solutreans is that they didn't stop once they got to Spain and Britain. They were in Britain, and they continued on. And the work of Bruce Bradley and Dennis Stanford in a book called Across Atlantic Ice, an incredible book, came out in 2012, that gave absolutely convincing evidence that the Solutreans had sailed to North America And the DNA evidence backs this up completely. It seems as though the areas that they were in had a particular type of mitochondrial DNA known as haplogroup X that can be traced all the way from Europe through the Orkney Islands, and you're going to hear a lot more about the importance of the Orkney Islands in the next couple of years, right the way across into northeast United States and Canada, which is very interesting because this is the same area where all the Denisovan DNA has been found. We can't link the two together yet, but there is a relationship. Right, here's images of boats, which almost certainly were done by the Solutreans to the left here at the El Castillo cave in Spain. This skiff-like boat on the top left, done by Solutrean artists, very similar to skiff-like boats that appear in the Bronze Age in Sweden. And obviously here's an Inuit boat called an umiek, if that's the correct pronunciation. And what we know about if the Solutreans did go to America, they end up becoming the so-called Clovis culture, who, although only date to about 11,000, essentially 11,000 BC for a few hundred years, they possibly got wiped out by a cataclysm. They created these beautiful Clovis points you can see on the bottom left of the picture, which match Solutrean points so closely, and various other tools that the Clovis people have also match Solutreans, that I think it's a pretty convincing case that the Solutreans became the Clovis people. And as I say, sadly were wiped out. Now, we talk all about a lot of these ideas in the Path of Souls, but what's also important is that the same ideas to do with Cygnus and the so-called Path of Souls and the constellation of Orion find their way into North America and seem to be the main cosmic geography behind a large number, possibly 30, 40 different tribes that all have a common origin, from Canada all the way down to Florida, that involve Cygnus, Orion, the Milky Way. It's what Greg and I both wrote about in the Path of Souls. We'll be talking about it again in the upcoming books. Now, one of the descendants of the Solutreans, one of their distant cousins, who used the same type of stone tool technology as the Solutreans, who I do believe inherited the Denisovan wisdom and knowledge, was the Swiderians. Now, I wrote about those in my book, Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, proposing that their elite groups entered into eastern Turkey, Anatolia as it's generally called by archaeologists, around 11,000 BC, and hung around there, and eventually became instrumental in the construction of Gobekli Tepe. I don't say that they were the only people. I think there was obviously a local population involved, but I think that they were the elite group, the so-called power elite that Professor Klaus Schmidt, the discoverer of Gobekli Tepe, talked about. He talked about this power elite behind the construction. I think it was the Swiderians. Even he talked about the Swiderians as possibly having links with the same culture, the same pre-pottery Neolithic culture that was responsible for Gobekli Tepe. In other words, the prime movers behind Gobekli Tepe came in from the north. And Gobekli Tepe was constructed about 9,600 BC. The earliest and most accomplished and sophisticated structures date to that, through to around 8,000 BC. That's about 1,500 years that building construction took place there. It was constructed on the top of a mountain, a series of stone enclosures, like megalithic, circular or ovoid shaped constructions were built across this period. The most sophisticated being enclosure D, which has these incredible tall central monoliths, which have these T-shaped capitals. They're anthropomorphic. They've got human features. They've got, or certainly one of the two has got a fox, in relief, leaping of it. And just next to them, just to the side of these two huge great monoliths at the centre of enclosure D, is probably the stone that is the key to understanding the cosmic geography of the Gobekli Tepe builders. And it's known as Pillar 43, and it's arguably the most well-known feature from the whole of the site, and has been in the news recently because some guys, professionals, have suggested that its carved imagery is evidence of a cataclysm, which obviously we know took place around 11,000 BC. And this has been all over the news. Graham Hancock and various other people have been all over this story. And when I read it, I just thought, this is just crap, to be honest. And it just doesn't. And I actually spoke to the archaeologists working on the site, and they were jumping up and down about it because they said it just doesn't fit. That the age, basically what they're saying is it was carved around 11,000 BC as like some memory of the actual day the cataclysm occurred, and I don't think this is what it represents at all. And I've worked over the years with engineer Rodney Hale, who's here today, and he went back to the drawing boards, and we'd already written about this in my book Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, and it features again in the Cygnus Key. And this time, Rodney, I think, discovered the key to really unlocking Pillar 43. And I'm not going to go into this in too much detail, but you can see on the left a drawing, schematic form of Pillar 43. And there are various components on here. There is this funny-shaped vulture, which myself and other people, even before me, had identified as the absolute likeness of the Cygnus constellation in 9600 BC. And on the wing of this vulture, you've got this strange ball. Now, I'd already identified this as probably a symbol of the human soul, which was represented as a ball, sometimes with three little tiny circles in it representing eyes and mouth, during the early Neolithic age in Anatolia. That's accepted fact. And at the very base of the pillar, you've got this little man on the back of another bird that's possibly another vulture, and he's headless, and he's also got a erect penis as well, but that's another story. But anyway, cut a long story short here, is that although we'd recognise that Cygnus was probably represented on this stone by the vulture, which was an ultimate symbol of death and rebirth in the Neolithic world, basically due to the process of excarnation, the fact that vultures were allowed to peck clean bodies that were put out on these wooden platforms, and that the vulture became an ultimate symbol of the transference, the carrying of the soul from this world to the next. And that also on the pillar below the vulture is a scorpion, which is universally identified as the Scorpius constellation. This was originally identified in I think 2011 by an archaeoastronomer by the name of Juan Antonio Belmonte, a proper academic. So clearly, if Scorpius was represented, other features on there probably were astronomical as well. So anyway, cut a long story short, what Rodney realised is that ball doesn't just represent a human soul and possibly even some kind of hole or entrance into the sky world, which is what I'd already stated, but almost certainly that hole marks the northern celestial pole. And when the northern celestial pole, the turning point of the heavens, when you look towards the north, around which all the stars revolve, is superimposed on that exact spot, everything fits into place. Cygnus, Scorpius, and everything else suddenly is revealed. And, when I first saw this, I thought, he's got it. He's absolutely got it. And so in many cultures, ancient cultures, particularly in shamanic tradition, the northern celestial pole, doesn't matter what particular star marked it, always represented the entrance to the sky world and was seen as an actual hole. That's what it represents. That is the hole in the pole, quite literally. It is the entrance into the sky world and should, quite rightly, be superimposed over Pillar 43, otherwise known as the Vulture Stone, and that's what it shows, in my opinion. In other words, Pillar 43 is about cosmic geography. It is the path from the physical, mundane world into the sky world. It is exactly the same tradition that is in the Path of Souls tradition in amongst 30 to 40 American tribes. It's exactly the same cosmic geography that we find in the Lascaux cave that was practiced by the Solutrean peoples, and I am positive that all of this goes back to around 40 to 45,000 years ago and was inherited by the Denisovans. And just to back up the Cygnus connection, I'm not going into that in any detail today, but various of the primary and the largest and the oldest enclosures at Gobekli Tepe are aligned towards the setting of the bright star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus. And Cygnus, although is seen as a swan, right that way across the Eurasian continent and in North America, interestingly enough, in the Near East and in Armenia, it was seen as a vulture. So I think that's very, very important. Now, all of these ideas, and this is what I'll be showing in the Cygnus Key, end up in Egypt. And this is one of the reasons why I think Cygnus was so important in the Pyramid Age and is contained within the pyramid text, and it's why, in my opinion, the three pyramids of Giza are specifically aligned both in the horizontal and the vertical plane with the constellation of Cygnus. Orion was important, absolutely, and I show that both of them work hand in hand, in Egypt. But I'm nearly finished. Just a couple of things here. People have been coming up all day and asking about this big void that's been found inside the Great Pyramid. What is it? Well, it's here. The big oval that you can see here in red is roughly where it's been found. I'm sure you've all seen the story. The team of scientists have used something called muonography, which is basically the passage of cosmic rays through solid material to determine whether there was any hollows within the pyramid. They found a massive void in the area above the Grand Gallery and to the north of the King's Chamber, roughly in the location, although they've not said exactly where it is. They also found another void directly above the area of the entrance on the north side, both of them on the north side, because remember that the Great Pyramid is aligned towards the northern stars. This is the destiny of the soul in the pyramid text is towards the stars of the northern sky. And what is it? Everybody's been saying, what is it? Well, it probably doesn't contain an Atlantean crystal, as most people would like. I've been talking to my good friend and colleague Nigel Skinner-Simpson, who with Nigel in 2008 we rediscovered the lost cave system of Giza after 200 years. We know and been working on the Giza plateau for a long time. We both think we think it is, and we've got good evidence for this, but this will come out in the future. It probably is primarily a relieving chamber for the Grand Gallery, because we've got relieving chambers immediately above the King's Chamber. The King's Chamber, which have already been explored, and the other smaller void above the entrance is the relieving chamber for the entrance of it. That doesn't mean it doesn't contain any goodies or any nice graffiti or whatever, because I'm sure it will tell us a hell of a lot about the construction of the pyramid and who constructed it and whatever. So it's very, very exciting. And come with us next March. We're going to Egypt. where we will be looking at all of this then, myself, Hugh, Brian Forrester with the Kemet School. Still places available to that come out, and that's in March next year. This is the cover of my book, The Cygnus Key, the Denisovan Legacy, Gobekli Tepe and the Birth of Egypt. It's officially published in May, but it's actually being launched at New World Expo in San Francisco next April. So I look forward to that. Now in this, it will bring together, it will show you how the Denisovan Legacy ends up, creating Gobekli Tepe and then moving from Gobekli Tepe all the way into Egypt. And I will show you how exactly that happened. I will also show you the earliest sites in Egypt that relate to Gobekli Tepe, and I think we may have even found one of them, and that's another story for another day. But that's coming out. Now, as I said, I mentioned earlier, we are going to Siberia in 2019. Myself, Hugh, Debbie, hopefully some other of our friends here, and we want you to come with us. Now, we need to get out there, we need to, and I'm not being funny, I'm not made of money, so I can't just drop the hat and go out there, basically. I cannot do that. We have to do things another way, and we organise tours, and off the back of that we can do some research. So come with us, and it's going to be in July 2019, so plenty of time to save up. And all of the great sites connected with the Denisovans and a lot more, which I will be revealing, will be in there, basically. As I said, Egypt next March, and just a couple of adverts here. Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the books, Genesis of the Gods, Freudian there, is available outside, as is Atlantis and the Caribbean, my take on the whole Atlantis thing. And various other books of mine are out there. Richard Wald and Buster Todd are manning that this afternoon. So with that, I say thank you very much, and I shall see you a little later on tonight for part 2. Thank you.